commercial actors in outer space, the Trump administration's emphasis on the military and economic dimensions of space exploration is likely to outlive Trump's time in office. Other Asia-Pacific countries, most notably China, but also India, have also enthusiastically embraced space activities and sought new capabilities for national security as well as geopolitical leverage. To understand these issues, we have three stellar experts joining us today. Dr. David T. Burbach is an associate professor at the U.S. Naval War College and is an expert on civil-military relations, defense planning, and the relationship between international security and technology. Next, we have Dr. Namrata Goswami. She's an author, researcher, and analyst who focuses on great power politics, outer space, and counterinsurgency issues. Her latest book is titled Scramble for the Skies, the Great Power Competition to Control the Resources of Outer Space. And finally, we have Dr. Rajeshwari Pillai Rajagopalan, Distinguished Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, New Delhi, and the head of the Foundation's Nuclear and Space Policy Initiative. Dr. Pillai Rajagopalan has also served in India's National Security Council Secretariat as an assistant director. So welcome, all three of you. If I could, by way of introductory remarks, ask you, David, to describe how you see the evolution of US space policy over the next decade and its possible thrust under the Biden administration, and possibly also the role of private players, which as you know, President Obama had really made space for in a big way. And also, if you could just give us some sense of where you see China's own space program going.
Mm-hmm. Certainly. Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all today. Just to give you by way of giving a bit of background before explaining where I think Biden will be going, you're exactly right. The Obama administration marked the move towards a focus on commercial space, in part because President Trump has occasionally said that under Obama, NASA was shut down, there was grass growing through the runways, and while that's an exaggeration, the Obama administration was a period when, several decades of not really figuring out a replacement for the space shuttle or coming up with a new destination for American space exploration, when those trends really caught up. And Obama finally made the decision to pull the plug and shut down the space shuttle. On the plus side, really opened up the space for commercial space enterprises, and having NASA and the Defense Department look to rely more on private actors, but failed really to establish a new goal for American space exploration, certainly for human space exploration. The Trump administration's two big signature changes on the civilian side was to introduce the idea of going back to the moon, the Artemis program, as it's called, initially with a goal of returning to the moon by the end of the year 2024. On the military side, the creation of the U.S. Space Force. I'll focus more on the civilian side, but I'm certainly happy to take questions on on Space Force as well. And the Trump administration, to give them some real credit, NASA and the Trump administration's NASA administrator Jim Bridenstine have done a pretty good job of making that moon program, of building bipartisan support, of building a lot of international support. And there's, I think, a degree to which simply we had spent so long not really having a clear destination that, the idea of, okay, we're going to do the moon, we're going to make this happen, I think that's actually become somewhat ingrained. So while I've often been a bit of a pessimist on U.S. space goals, since we have spun our wheels so often, I think Biden is going to keep that goal of going to the moon. I don't think he's going to shut down eliminate that goal. What I think is going to happen is that we'll see under Biden relatively few big changes in the direction of American space policy. I think it'll become a lower priority, and we'll be facing some real resource challenges. On the moon as the big goal, again, there's not an obvious alternative. The space station is built out, and it's going to keep operating, and we're going to have to think about a replacement at some point. But if the American government wants to have some big animating goal in its space program, there's no obvious replacement for the current moon program. And I think it's now institutionalized enough, not only in international support, but in major contracts that have been given out, that I don't think the administration is going to want to scrap that and start all over again. And also, one thing that I think will factor into that, because of COVID, the commercial airliner manufacturing industry, which is a very important industry in the United States, is in a huge recession. So this is not a period when the administration would want to throw even more aerospace workers out of their jobs by cutting back on the space program. On the contrary, they may see it as a way to keep that sector going. Where I do think the moon program dovetails nicely with what appears to be a theme of Biden's national security strategy is the importance of allies. What we're hearing out of the Biden team so far is a lot of emphasis on strengthening ties with allies, and coming from an era when the Trump administration was not always the best friend to our allies. I think Biden would like to rebuild those ties. And that the NASA Administrator Bridenstine and the U.S. State Department moved so fast to build international participation in the moon program is going to matter a lot. For example, Japan will be having Toyota build a pressurized moon rover that astronauts would be able to use to travel around the moon. Canada will be contributing hardware. The Europeans will be contributing hardware. So unlike the Apollo program, there are going to be fundamental parts of the hardware, fundamental parts of the architecture that are built by American allies, and allied participation. We recently announced that a Canadian astronaut will join the first crewed mission, which will not land but will orbit around the moon like the Apollo 8 mission did. And I suspect you'll see more. I mean, one anecdote I've mentioned is it would be interesting to see to see a Japanese astronaut set foot on the moon before a Chinese astronaut. Not in a Japanese spacecraft, but joining an American mission to the moon. I think that's actually quite possible, and geopolitically, that'll be attractive. So I think Biden's going to, continue to the international angle. I think will keep the program moving. Where I do think you will see some change in the unmanned side of space exploration and space applications. The Biden team has already signaled they intend to put more emphasis on using space to monitor climate change on the Earth. And we've seen this the last several administrations. Republican administrations put less emphasis on satellites for monitoring Earth climate and resources. Democrats tend to put more emphasis. So we'll probably see some proposed NASA missions for climate monitoring and research that will get funded. The big questions that I see is, well, the very biggest question is resource constraints. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to afford to do all this, given the economic difficulties from COVID that will last for quite some time. The Republicans in Congress, even though they will no longer have a majority, are still probably going to be inclined to limit spending by the administration. And simply, the moon program is ambitious. It's going to require more money than is currently in the budget. And so at some point, Biden is probably going to face a question of what gets cut. For Mars, the Mars sample return is an expensive idea that late in this decade that might be in danger. If I had to guess, but we'll have to see what they choose. Now, to quickly say a bit about the Chinese space program, the China's program, if I can make a contrast to the American program, China has really stuck to plans over the years. If you look back at what 15 years ago China said they would do in space, they've stuck pretty close to it. Most recently with the sample return from the moon just last month, they're likely to they're likely to continue a lunar focus in their program. They've really actually laid out a pretty good set of milestones for both robotic and human exploration that come together in a Chinese crewed mission to the moon sometime in the 2030s. So I think, and they clearly see, they won't be the first on the moon, but they'll be the first non-American country on the moon. It would clearly show that they are the number two. Perhaps they hope to be number one, but unambiguously obviously China would be a space leader and doing things that no other country has done. Certainly the first Asian country to achieve some of those first. So I think they're likely to continue that focus. If I had to say who's going to be ahead in space in 2030, I would still bet on the United States over China. But I think China will be a pretty unambiguous number 2 by that point. I'm just about out of time. I'll just very quickly note on the commercial side. One suggestion earlier was to ask, how might other countries, how about countries in the region duplicate some of the success that America has had with SpaceX and other companies? I'll give a glib answer that it would be good to have billionaires who love space. I'm only partly facetious in saying that. One reason why SpaceX or Blue Origin with Jeff Bezos from Amazon or Virgin Galactic with Richard Branson have done well is there's a pattern of space startups. When the economy or the stock market go down, they run out of money and go out of business. Having billionaires has allowed these companies to survive downturns because they're getting cash from their owners. I think probably a better way to, a better place to start is, the problem with building a rocket is until it works, you can't make any money at all. So it's a tremendously capital intensive, R&D intensive business. There's probably a lot of opportunity, though, in satellite applications, small satellites or services that make use of data from satellites. And, if I were trying to build up some space expertise in industry, I'd probably start on that front. So let me stop there and hand it back.
Thank you, David. Very interesting thoughts, and the point you make about the role of private sector's billionaires interested in space, and they have the pockets. They can do things. They can take risks essentially. But then this kind of naturally leads me to what I would ask you, Namrata, to address, which is China's model of space exploration, because you obviously have a situation where there is no private sector, or there is a private sector by name only, rather. So under such circumstance, China's future trajectory of its space program is likely to look substantially different, even though the goals would remain the same. So can you just give us a sense of where China, Namrata, where China is going with its space program again, especially when it comes to resource exploitation in outer space, moon mining, and also relatedly the future of regimes that have so far constrained certain kinds of behavior in space?
Sure, Abhignan, thank you so much, and thank you for having me. So I think I'll continue in terms of what David mentioned, and that is one thing that you observe with the Chinese space program, at least in terms of strategy, is that they are able to meet the timelines that they set. So for example, the landing on the far side of the moon, which happened in 2019, that was planned in 2010. And they had actually announced the goal of going and launching in 2018 December. I see a similar trajectory with regard to the Mars mission, which launched this year. They announced that 10 years back. And it's interesting and actually offers you a pattern of at least their behavior. I think this point is important because when we look at past capability to meet goals, especially goals which have not been accomplished before, like landing on the far side, you will then realize that some of the goals that the China National Space Administration has announced for the moon, for example, going for a lunar sample return, which they achieved this last year. Then in 2024, they want to launch again to the South Pole this time, to carry out a survey, and then by 2030 to bring back samples. And by 2036 to establish a research base to the goal of enabling Chinese space capability to accomplish mining. Now, those are very clear goals that have been announced. And then of course they have their Mars mission, which is going to land in February this year, which actually wants to accomplish 3 goals together. One is entering Martian orbit, second landing on the Martian surface, and then finally releasing a rover. So it's very interesting times in space for China. Now, I think what I would do now is to address some of the questions that were posed to me. And the first question is that, is moon mining, especially that China is talking about in terms of this large scale industrial level development, is it actually feasible? commercially. So I think when we ask that question, there are two things to keep in mind. Are we asking about moon mining that's actually talking about returning resources back to Earth? Or are we talking about moon mining that enables further development or exploration of space? So that's two important questions to realize. Second, what is the time frame we are talking about? And I think this is a critical policy question because almost the conversations coming out of China is not about doing it today. It's actually doing it in the next 15 years. So there is a very long timeline. And then by 2049, which is their 100-year celebration, they want to accomplish this particular goal. Now, these questions are actually not independent of policy because if you realize how technology develops, it's always about first enabling contracts by the government to create a market, to create subsidies. You would see that with the GPS Navstar that developed in the 1960s that actually required government funding and then later became commercially viable. And I say this because I just recently read a very excellent book called Strategy of Technology, where they actually predicted that by the end of the 20th century, we will have commercial GPS for almost all of us. And in the 60s, they were actually laughed at that this is not going to happen. So you see that in the development of such technology, especially for moon mining, I would predict that, and this is what's going to happen, is that in the next 15 years, you will have commercial private entities that will accomplish a demonstration of ability. And I think in the next 20 years, there will be some level of commercial return of investment. And if you look at China's plans, they are actually also talking about such long-term timelines. Now, some of the private companies to watch, especially in China, that are talking about developing the additive manufacturing, 3D printing, are OneSpace, iSpace, LinkSpace. So it's not that China does not have a private sector. In fact, in the last 3 years, President Xi's focus has been to develop the Chinese private space sector by enabling the kind of subsidies which actually developed companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin in 20 years ago. Without NASA contracts, these particular companies would have probably not survived, especially SpaceX, if not Blue Origin. Now, what is important to realize is that the second point, I think, about China, and that is something that I say with some level of seriousness, is that unlike the US, the one advantage that China's space program has is that it does not go through this change in administrations. So if President Xi has committed to a particular goal, and that is about lunar mining development, or even empowering China to become a very critical space player, that goal is going to continue because you do not have change in administration and change in policy. And you see that if you look at the trajectory of Chinese space power. Now, the final point about China I'll make is that if you look at their conversations on space, they're not limiting their conversations to support systems on Earth. They're actually talking about much further goals. And as David mentioned, in that particular furtherance of space capacity, the moon becomes extremely important. And I think what they have realized is that the viability of moon mining, especially the commercial viability, is not very far off. It's not today, but in the next 15, 20 years, especially with the launch of rockets like Starship, which is capable of actually landing on the moon by, say, in 10 years, which is the goal, the launch cost will come down. And so they're also developing their own heavy lift capability, which is the Long March 9. So it's a very fascinating year for space and going forward. Now, your question about what are the prospects of new regimes for space and basically what are the contentions, I think what is going to happen is that as major spacefaring nations like the US, China, start to view space not from the Cold War mindset, where you talked about going somewhere first and coming back and demonstration of capability like the Apollo program, but you're actually talking about robotic explorations, robotic development of mining capabilities. You're talking about space resource utilization. I think the regimes will have to account for this changing future. So, and so you could see the conversations already starting. Within the US, we have the Artemis Accords, the preamble of it, that tells us that utilization of space resources is possible. You have the US Commercial Space Launch Competitive Act 2015 that actually enables US citizens to own the resources that they mine. You have countries like Luxembourg, who has come out with space mining legislation. And I think this year, China National Space Administration has announced that China will come up with his own national space legislation. So you can see that there is the development of governance regimes. See, the problem here is that will this be contested norms, or will this lead to some kind of convergence? So there are contestation that, for example, the word utilization in the Outer Space Treaty does not enable utilization of resources. It's so you have those contestation, but the problem, and I think the contestation, is that a country can interpret a particular word by the way it wants to interpret it. So the other contention is that in my strategic understanding, I am also concerned because there is a strategic culture tendency from China that if you are somewhere first in a particular area, you do have the entitlement right of establishing the normative regime around that. You could see that in the South China Sea. You can see that in the conversations about Tibet, and especially areas like, say, the lunar South Pole, which is rich in resources. If you go somewhere first, you might basically claim that you have the first entitlement right. And that could lead to a fraying of regimes as they exist today, because we do not have a space law governance regime that deals with that kind of future. I think almost all the space laws that we deal with did not account for the private sector as well. They were conceived at the time when states were the primary actor, the 67 Outer Space Treaty, which were mostly concerned about the deployment of nuclear weapons in space, and so wanted to make sure that weapons of mass destruction are not placed there. I don't think what, for example, SpaceX is going to accomplish in the next 5-10 years in terms of launching the world's largest reusable rocket. There are conversations about asteroid mining, lunar mining. I don't think these concepts are clearly understood or dealt with. And I think we will require additional protocols to deal with it. The conversations have started. You have the Hague International Space Resource Governance Group. You have the International Institute of Space Law that basically are talking about enabling structures for this. Now, finally, the question that was posed to me is that what are the prospects of China-Europe Space Cooperation? I think in the next 2 minutes, what I'll say is that joint research between China and European Space Agency started since 1989. You have joint research in terms of the Dragon Research Space Program. They have actually collaborated, including with the Chandrayaan-5 navigation system. And I think what is interesting from a strategic perspective is that the European Space Agency basically makes arguments that next year, when China launches the permanent space station, they would look forward to cooperating with that because of the concern that the International Space Station might not continue to be funded. So there is a safety net with the Chinese space station. They even want to, and I think what China has accomplished this year and last year is that they have been able to demonstrate very difficult space technology and capacity, including lunar sample return, landing on the far side, missions to Mars, and space-based solar power plant in Chongqing, China, that has actually made them an attractive partner to cooperate. And the final point is that money matters. So China is willing to invest in European space startups. You have a China-Luxembourg Memorandum of Understanding, where you have Luxembourg established space companies that can get investment from the Belt and Road Initiative. So financial contribution is a very elemental and key component of China-European space cooperation as well. And I think that's the final point that I'll make in terms of space cooperation between China and the European Space Agency. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Namrata. A very interesting set of remarks, especially about China's, how she sees the Chinese private sector also developing and playing an analogous role like SpaceX in the United States. Raji, coming to you, you have written and analyzed the possibility of, or actually the growing chances of space becoming an intensely contested space. Militarization is rampant with the rise of anti-satellite weapons. Could you give us a sense of where you see space-based military assets playing a role in terrestrial confrontation? So something that starts on Earth and how do you see space-based assets playing a role? And I would also like you to give us a sense of where you see Russia and India going with their space programs, because both of them are important players, especially India. They both have, there's a military dimension to their space, their space programs, but there's also an active commercial and civilian dimension. So if you can just cover that, and also give us a sense of where you see the strategic dynamics between what the Russians are doing, what the Americans are doing, what the Chinese are doing, interacting, and how each other's space programs are shaping and influencing the other.
Thank you, Abhignan, and thank you for having me out here. It's been a very interesting conversation so far. So space has become so integral to military operations today. So there are varying degrees of military utilization of space, but space militarization is something that has already happened. What we are trying to address is the process toward the trend towards space weaponization. But I think there is also the key question: what role do U.S. space assets will play in a terrestrial conflict, for instance, in between US and China? And I think without a doubt, a huge role. In fact, this is part of the broader trend that you see, greater dependence on space, and especially from a security and defense sector, has given way to development of counter space capabilities. Of course, this is not entirely new, but I think space did not have such a permeating role in conventional military operations that you see today. And advanced militaries such as the US has such a network and with heavy reliance on space that it has made countries such as China invest in capabilities to deny certain advantages to adversaries that may come through the use of space. And China has been looking at studying the US military operations for that matter, and recognize this heavy US reliance on space as a vulnerability that China can take advantage of. And the US has a network of sophisticated command control communications, computer-based intelligence ISR functions operating in a very synergistically in and through space. So I think this is something that the US is also very aware of. The US senior DoD officials have come out to talk about as to how they recognize both the Chinese and the Russian efforts at weaponizing space through development of whether it is anti-satellite ASAT missiles, directed energy, and a whole range of other electronic and cyber warfare and so on and so forth. So all designed to hold the US and the allied networks, space systems at risk in a sense. And I think this is something that is very, very clear over the last few years if you look at the kind of trends that you're seeing. So long and short of this is that the US space assets will play a significant role in a US-China terrestrial conflict, and precisely driven by this US dependence on space, China has understood that this is a vulnerable spot for the US that for Beijing to target in a sense. But the reality is that as Beijing becomes more and more heavily networked with space assets, their own vulnerabilities also go up. So that's the other counterpart to it. The other question that was posed to me is to kind of look at, for instance, the use of anti-satellite missile ASATs to target an adversary satellite, and what would that be an escalatory step? And I think that's something that has been interesting sort of a question, because there is a growing number of cases where non-kinetic weapons such as electronic and cyber warfare capabilities have actually been used, not in, of course, in combat, but they have been teased out in many cases for the last more than a decade now. And in fact, many of the norms that have prevailed for more than 2 decades are also being broken by some of the new space players like China and India. For instance, the norm not to conduct an ASAT test was broken in the second half of the 2000s when China conducting the first successful ASAT test in January 2007. Similarly, the use of electronic and cyber warfare means in space, again, is breaking some of the norms like non-interference in each other's satellite operations. So these trends are bad enough in a sense, but I think the use of an ASAT missile against a satellite will be extremely escalatory in nature because anyone who does that is going to gain an immediately significant advantage that will prompt an immediate response. And I see it as a hugely escalatory step in a conflict, or rather such an act could itself become the cause of a major conflict in a sense. And if this were to happen in a US-China conflict, the response is going to be, I can almost feel that it's going to be almost instantaneous in a sense. But besides the direct escalation cost, I think there are other serious implications as well. One, there will be too much of debris, space debris that is going to be created as a result of this, but there could be also other unintended consequences. For instance, other satellites, how they will be affected by such an ASAT targeting in a sense. For instance, you can target a satellite of a particular country, but I think it's almost impossible for you to discriminately target a satellite, but you are going to end up essentially affecting other satellites, their functioning as well. And hence, it is going to be indiscriminatory in nature. Assume that China undertakes such an attack on a US satellite, but there could be an Indian satellite or a French or a Japanese satellite in the proximity, which could also be damaged. And so essentially, you're drawing additional set of countries into a possible conflict. So those are, again, things that you need to be mindful of. And I think that's precisely, so in many ways, I would argue that deterrence is what holds some peace in some sense. And deterrence remains one important factor for countries that could potentially halt the negative trend, including the use of ASATs against satellites in a sense. So fear of consequences, and I think that is what is preventing the use of ASATs against another country's satellites, because if you do it, others have the possibility as others will do it as well. So therefore, one can say that there is a need to emphasize and enhance the deterrence aspect by stressing the fact that no one country will have an advantage and that it's going to be drawing everyone into a negative spiral. But again, there are dangers to this. And one of the pitfalls of deterrence is that obviously, states' behavior needs to be shrouded in, especially in the space domain, is going to be shrouded in secrecy. This lack of information and insecurity that gives way to a lot more mistrust, lack of communication, and this can be a cyclical process in an action-reaction cycle. So, and I think there are plenty of lessons one has seen on the nuclear side, evidence of this action-reaction spiral among states. So that needs to be something that needs to be mindful of in a sense. Let me come to the third question to look at some of the other, apart from the US and China, there are other major players, and what are they doing about their moon missions, but also other larger programs in a sense. And of course, when I look at it, I think especially in the Indo-Pacific region, India, Japan, France, and Russia, of course. But I think when you look at India's own plans, I think especially with regard to its moon missions, the first moon mission was undertaken in 2008, which was a very fairly simple mission. And India undertook a second moon mission, Chandrayaan-3 in 2019, which resulted in a hard landing. But I think now after the unsuccessful second attempt at landing on the lunar surface, India is planning to do a Chandrayaan-3 mission on its own in 2021. This is going to be India's second attempt to soft land on the surface of the moon in a sense. But I think there are other countries who are also pursuing because moon is back in fashion, moon missions are back in fashion. So Russia has an active lunar program wherein they plan to send a lander to explore natural resources. The Luna 25 is meant to be the South Pole lander to be launched in October 2021. But I think this is also part of the broader lunar globe program, which eventually plans to establish a fully robotic lunar base and so on and so forth. But then I think one should also remember that Russia has had major goals for quite some time, many of which have not been materialized because of the resource constraints. So I think they have set out a long-term goal, but I think many of them are running into difficulties. Japan is the other interesting country that has been pursuing a lot of the moon missions, but nothing that compares to the scale of China's advances with regard to moon missions. It has currently an ongoing program which was approved in 2017, and they plan to be launching it in 2022. It's called the Smart Lander for Investigating Moon, SLIM, which is a lunar lander program developed by JAXA, which is a mission to test and demonstrate the precision landing technology. And this is again going to be Japan's first lunar surface mission. So while these are important missions on their own, to me, I think what is important and more fascinating is the kind of partnerships that are emerging in the Indo-Pacific region. Because on the one hand, there's a lot of space security sort of driven, competition-driven programs that are running on its own. But there's also driving a number of Indo-Pacific powers to come together in undertaking joint missions. In this regard, to me, I think one of the most fascinating one is the India-Japan joint moon mission, which is in the making. The project is expected to be ready by 2024. 2024 for launching. It's called the LUPEX, Lunar Polar Exploration Mission, meant to study, in some sense, this is actually what India was planning to undertake with this Chandrayaan-3 mission, to study the moon for quantity of water resource on the water source on the surface, and as well as other available resources that can be potentially tapped into. And I would say, I think this is somewhat more meaningful and fruitful a mission in some sense. Similarly, India and France again have had a history of collaboration in space as well as in other areas. In October last year, for instance, not necessarily to do with lunar missions, but both the countries agreed to undertake a joint Venus mission in a sense. But I think this is essentially a follow-up from the March 2018 when both India and France had issued a joint visions for space cooperation, which went on to say that both space agencies would work together in exploring the polar systems and beyond, including joint work on autonomous navigation on rovers on the moon, Mars, and other planets. So I think there are some, and of course, there are growing collaboration between India and US, mostly on looking at the space situational awareness, which has become extremely critical in the current challenging times. And also there are ongoing dialogues on space security in addition to civil space cooperation. But I do see emerging some sort of even though it is not going to be called a quad space collaboration, but the fact is that India is trying to engage all the Quad countries and others into a larger sort of Indo-Pacific space collaborative effort in a sense. And I think that's here to stay, for instance, including countries like France into the Indo-Pacific schemes of things. So let me stop there and I'll be happy to take on any questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Raji. That was a very comprehensive review of what other powers in the Asia-Pacific region are doing when it comes to space and their space programs. Let me start the question, the Q&A part of this discussion, with the question for all three of you, which is the idea of outer space as a global commons dead? Because you saw the executive order that the Trump administration issued in April last year, where the administration said that, well, we can go ahead with moon mining and commercial exploitation of space resources. But in general, beyond the issue of mining or resource extraction, can we eventually get around to establishing a set of norms that consolidates the idea of space as global commons? So I'll start with you, David, for your response.
Sure. Well, when NASA Administrator Bridenstine was talking about the Artemis Accords, he suggested the Trump administration has been clear to try and say this has not changed the role of space as a commons. They've analogized it to high seas fishing, that the ocean remains a commons, but resource exploitation is allowed. Anybody who's familiar with the problems of overfishing and illegal fishing around the world had to be a little uncomfortable with that analogy. So I would, I hate to take a wishy-washy, well, it's not dead, but it's changing. I don't think there's going to be any real change in the basic notion that countries can't claim sovereignty. I think, space is sufficiently big, the moon is sufficiently big that I don't think we're going to run into intense conflicts anytime soon. And so even if the Trump administration, the Biden administration will probably lean more towards a commons, and even the Trump administration, tried to, because where I think the administration has been concerned is there are some there's a treaty that only a few countries have signed called the late 70s Moon Treaty that suggests that resources, that essentially private exploitation of resources is not allowed. That if there's any use of moon resources, it would have to be some sort of international effort to share the benefits widely with all countries. The U.S. definitely doesn't agree with that view, but I don't think we're going to be leaning to the point that we want to see, like gold miners staking claims to parts of the moon or to particular orbits. So I'm there's definitely a bit of worry, and there are some very specific places where some of the areas at the South Pole where maybe there won't be enough to share in the near term. But I don't think it's dead yet. But it's definitely facing some new challenges.
Namrata?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because if you, as you mentioned, if I read that particular executive order that the Trump administration issued last year in April, and I think the rationale behind instituting that order is because the US did not want to treat the Moon Agreement as a customary international law. And in international law, if a state stays silent, it is assumed that it has become international customary law. So there was a legal reason why they did that. There are great conversations around that. But also it did state that it will not treat space as a global common. And in the Outer Space Treaty, the word global common is not used. It's province of mankind. Now, I think there will be contestation because of the fact that if you look at conversations coming out from China, there is a tussle. So on the one hand, those who are scientists tend to view space as a global common. Because they agree that international collaboration, scientific exchanges are critical to advance human exploration needs. But you see, the discourse on space is changing. It is becoming a lot about utilization and exploitation now. So exploration, space science missions, extending our knowledge of the universe could mean that it will be a global common. But once you have resources, for example, the ability to extract cobalt on the moon, which is critical for batteries. Say in the next 15 years, you have companies from the US that want to demonstrate a very small mission. Once you have issues over property rights, so you might not claim sovereignty, but you can claim that the resources extracted belong to you. And in fact, the US private sector lobbied for the US Space Commercial Launch Act because they wanted to have surety. Now, in that particular context, there could be contestation about the use global common, because after all, companies want to return profit on their investment. And I'll add with the final point. If you listen to Chinese space thinkers like General Yang Zhulin, or even the lead scientist of China's space program, who actually conceived of the entire idea of the moon as benefiting humankind or Chinese citizens in terms of bringing back resources. Now you can see the tension there too. You have a very nationalistic space program. It's about, so space has been conceived by President Xi Jinping as very critical for the national rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And so given the fact that the grand strategic thinking on space is very nationalistic within a country like China, I would assume that there will be a tendency that once you have resources that are worth trillions of dollars, which is basically the argument even made by Bao Weiming last year, that China would hope to return about $10 trillion annually by 2050. And he lays out a plan. And that's why I said it's not feasible today, but in the next 20 years, there is so much technology capability development that is happening around the world, including in China. I am concerned that there will be a contestation with the word global common because of these developments.
Raji?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. No, I think it's a terrific question. But to me, on the one hand, you have the, you have all the moon missions and other ways of asteroid mining and so on. So supposedly, a lot of the peaceful pursuit of peaceful exploration of space for a number of different purposes, in a sense. But to me, along with that, you also have significant space security developments, and those activities are still not covered under the existing rules and rules of the road, in a sense. The Outer Space Treaty, for instance, does not really talk about conventional weapons. It only prohibits states from deploying a placement of weapons of mass destruction. So what happens to cyber activities in space? What happens to the disruptions created through the use of electronic warfare in space? So none of those activities are, and the bigger problem to me, okay, all of these are serious problems: radio frequency interference, cyber interference, all of those are creating disruptions or destroying assets and so on and so forth. But to me, the bigger problem is the lack of consensus among major powers to decide or to agree upon first as to what are the different challenges that we are facing. So there is not even an agreement whether it is it arms race that is a bigger problem today, or is it radio frequency interference, or is it space debris, which is a bigger problem? So you don't even have an agreement among the major powers as to what are the bigger challenges, what are those challenges that you need to agree to. Only then can you talk about the next set of steps as to what are those possible solutions. And again, here you have clear divisions. You have two schools of thought, one that believes in legally binding verifiable measures, and a second set of countries that believe in that is not the, given the current political climate, you're not going to enter into legally binding agreements, and therefore you need to move towards transparency and confidence building measures, TCBMs, more political agreements. But I think this is something that you have seen hugely problematic. But whether you need rules of the road, you do seriously need rules of the road for space. And the existing rules are not enough to, they don't have. In terms of both, also, I would very quickly look at the institutions that are tackling some of these issues. You have the Vienna-based UN COPUOS, the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, which has the mandate only on the civilian and peaceful activities of outer space, and entire range of military space activities, arms control related issues are discussed at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, which has not debated anything in the last more than 2 decades now. So since 1996, in a sense, when the last was the CTBT discussions, since then there has been nothing being discussed there. So the venues that traditionally discuss some of the rulemaking in the space domain are stuck in a space with no progress, no movement at all. So we need rules of the road. So we need to come up with innovative measures. But again, to me, the biggest challenge is the lack of consensus among major powers, to the point that you had the UNGG, the group of governmental experts. I was part of that group, which met in 2018-19, which was on PAROS, which is Prevention of Arms Race in Outer Space, which met, and after two-week-long sessions, 1 year of process, there was not even a consensus document that came out of it. That tells you about the stubborn nature of difficulties, the serious difficulties and impediments in developing consensus among major powers. So we need rules of the road, but I do not see, and I think therefore I would say maybe we need to go for small technical measures, tackling one smaller issue than looking at an overarching comprehensive legal instrument and so on and so forth. Maybe the first step is to have certain TCBMs that would instill certain confidence and trust in each other, which would tackle the political difficulties in developing rules of the road.
Excellent. The second question is from Catherine Butts, who's the managing editor of The Diplomat. And Katie asks a very interesting question. Is US-China cooperation in outer space possible, or the idea is firmly dead on arrival? So can US and China cooperate in the future on something like at the International Space Station or an analog of the International Space Station? So your thoughts, David?
It's a great question, and for any of the viewers who don't know, right now U.S.-China cooperation is extremely constrained, not just because of general tension in the relationship, but there's actually the U.S. Congress has imposed a law that basically prohibits NASA from barely even speaking to any Chinese agencies. I think politically that would be very difficult to change. Sentiment towards China has shifted sharply negative in the last couple of years in the U.S. So I think it is unlikely to really change. The one note, though, there are a few incoming Biden team members who do think that policy is a mistake and think that getting China on board with the United States might present some opportunities to reduce tensions. I'm a little skeptical. Like there are those, the U.S.-Soviet cooperation missions in the early 1970s reflected détente. They didn't cause détente. But there is some interest, or at least a belief that, if we'd invited China to the ISS program in the 1990s instead of pushing them away, maybe China wouldn't be, so far along in developing its own program. Maybe effectively we could have co-opted the Chinese into being part of a U.S. coalition. And the other possible note, where there might be some cooperation, the big emphasis on climate change. And in fact, John Kerry, former senator who will be the lead person on climate change, specifically thinks that climate change is the number one issue in the U.S.-China relationship, and that we should be willing to, trade off on other issues to facilitate climate cooperation. Maybe there's an opportunity for, maybe that will lead to reaching out for some potential climate monitoring satellite cooperation. But I'm skeptical that the U.S. politics are going to allow that, even if there are some individuals in the Biden team who are interested.
Namrata, can you give your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sure. So again, great question. I think if I offer you the Chinese perspective on this, so we hear a lot about the US perspective that of course it's not allowed because there is a ban. But when I was in China and I asked this question, the answer I got was very interesting and strategic. Their argument was that once China reaches a high level of space technology and capacity, the US will be forced to cooperate with China. So that's a very interesting strategic thinking in the next, and they always tell you that this is a long-term capability and China is going to advance, including in AI, 5G, and everything else that's connected to space autonomous operations. So that's the number one factor. The number two factor is that in terms of the specific question on is China going to cooperate with the International Space Station? Well, China will have its own permanent space station by 2022. So I don't think they are looking for cooperation. They will actually project their International Space Station, and they're already doing that. They've signed an MOU with the United Nations Office on Outer Space Affairs to actually have countries collaborate with the Chinese space station as an international alternative to the ISS. So that's my second point. My final point in terms of just looking at cooperation in general, I think we cannot look at US-China space cooperation in a vacuum. You have to look at it from the larger grand strategic perspective. And I think there are certain concerns that I hear. One is that, is China going to honor rules of the road once it signs on to it? So China's behavior, for example, in the South China Sea with the draft code of conduct, where it signed on into agreements and then behaved completely differently, the fear of technology theft and intellectual property right is still a very big concern in the United States. And I think that is a kind of a factor that will limit US-China space cooperation. And I think the final factor in terms of what could be another concern is that if you look at US grand strategic thinking, it also cares about what happens in China with regard to democratic rights and human rights. And so what happened in Hong Kong yesterday, 53 pro-democracy activists all got arrested under the national security law. So those will create countervailing pressures of limiting a very convergent US-China space cooperation, since it always worked within that larger political and strategic culture.
Raji?
Yeah, very quickly, I think I agree with both David and Namrata in their points. And I think there is the whole culture of, first of all, as to why NASA, there's a legal instrument that restricts the kind of collaboration between NASA and this Chinese Space Agency. And that comes from the fact that the intellectual theft and whole range of things that have happened in the past that have actually limited or restricted the nature of collaboration between the US and China. Whether this would change immediately, and I'm not very optimistic about that, because the kind of fractured relationship that you see between US and China, but I think even the larger contested and competitive nature of outer space politics and security itself. And I think that is going to that is not going to permit or allow for a collaborative approach between US and China in a sense in the immediate time frame. Having said that, I think there are a few within, like I think David touched upon it. You have people within the Biden team who are looking at maybe making some sort of a quid pro quo. Can China work with the US on the climate change issue, for instance, or maybe some other aspect? Can China work with the US on some of those things? Promise them, but that's a very slim possibility, and I don't see sort of a US-China space collaboration happening really anytime very soon. And I don't think China is interested either. China has major collaborative agreements with Russia in a sense, and I think they stand to gain a lot from Russia. The Russians are the junior partner. They stand to gain a lot more from that relationship. So I don't think they are looking to partner with the US in any way.
Excellent. We have very little time, so just for one final question for all of you. So keep it short. A member of the audience asks, what about smaller actors, smaller states in the Asia Pacific, especially Southeast Asia, ASEAN? Does ASEAN have a role in all of this, or is it essentially a big boys club, big economies thinking big? So David, can you short reaction to this?
Sure. I'll keep it very short because I suspect Raji and Namrata both follow Southeast Asia more than I do. By which I mean I don't really follow it much. I don't know much about the government's the interest in those regions. I will say, in terms of opportunities for collaboration, NASA with Artemis has been looking to create opportunities. To make available opportunities not only for countries contributing major pieces of hardware like Japan or the European Space Agency, but for small scale scientific collaboration. So there is an effort to reach out, and of course, and the model that I would suggest small countries look at, the UAE has really done a lot. They currently have a mission on the way to Mars arriving next month. Though they don't have a space launch capability, they have really built up some capability in space exploration, space applications, and it's obviously easier to do that if you have oil revenues, but it seems like a pretty well executed program for a power that's not a world leading great power.
Namrata?
So the ASEAN question actually, again, is a critical question. So Indonesia, of course, has one of the most advanced space programs, including their own satellites. You have other countries that are wanting to become a part of the space infrastructure. So in that context, I think within the ASEAN or Southeast Asian region, there is an interesting diplomatic tussle. So you have China's Belt and Road Initiative that actually includes Space Information Corridor as part of their cooperative partnership. And you have ASEAN countries that have signed on to it. Thailand actually uses the Beidou navigation system today. So you will have that interesting component where a major power, for example, China and India, will try to offer their space capacity and services to countries to build diplomatic alliance systems. On their own, I haven't heard any exposition of ambitions that they're going to develop their own launch capacity or have developed their own space ecosystem, including private space sector. But there will be this interesting diplomatic tussle. I'll finally end by saying that I know we are talking about the Asia Pacific, but actually in today's context, you have an African Union, which actually has an African Space Agency today, and it's going to be headquartered in Egypt. So you can see that the atmosphere of space from the Cold War to today is changing. There are new actors. David mentioned UAE and Luxembourg, and then you have MOUs between UAE and Luxembourg. I see that there will be coming together of ASEAN countries and African Space Agency as well, because they will be able to then form this important question about influencing normative frameworks, especially by taking advantage of their membership in the United Nations. So we will actually have to keep that particular aspect in mind as well.
Raji?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a terrific question, because I think when you look at Indo-Pacific or the Asia-Pacific, when you look at it, and of course, Southeast Asia, an important component of that, it's a divided house. So one, you have in terms of, regional security cooperation efforts are led by both Japan, which is APRSF, Asia Pacific Regional Space Security Forum or something, APRSF. So that's a Japan-led space regional cooperation forum that you have. Then you have a China-led APSCO, Asia Pacific Space Cooperation Organization. So in a sense, and there's no framework, there's no kind of linkage between these two organizations in terms of creating new linkages, new collaborative ventures, and so on and so forth. So Asia Pacific actually has a very, very divided house. It's kind of, tone between the two. And India is part of the APRSF, partnering with Japan and other countries. But there are a lot of interesting bilateral conversations that are happening, whether it is Japan, for instance, launching a number of satellites for Vietnam, Singapore, India launching a number of satellites for Singapore. But there are also other important players who may not have come up to but they are the middle space powers. In Indonesia, for instance, Malaysia. These are countries that do have a sizable space industry, including a few private actors that are beginning to get a fair share of the space, become a part of the space ecosystem in these countries. But I think things to watch out for are countries like Singapore, Vietnam, and kind of Indonesia. These are the kind of places, given the kind of larger geopolitical ambitions, I think there is a security-driven kind of a competition as well. So space is no more looked at purely from a social and economic developmental perspective, but countries like Vietnam, for instance, partnering with India in a big way, or Japan in a big way. I think these are countries that are looking at space from a security perspective. What are the kind of monitoring mechanism that you have using space assets? So Asia Pacific is a very divided house, and that is going to be the trend because Asia itself is so divided. So, but I think there are important bilateral as well as possible trilateral, quadrilateral partnerships that will emerge in the coming years. You're on mute.
Yeah, so sorry. Thank you, Raji. Thank you, David and Namrata, for some excellent remarks, some excellent material for all of us to mull over. I think it's safe to say, if I could just conclude in the last couple of seconds, that the Earth and outer space are now linked politically, economically, and also in terms of norm making. So lots of excitement in the years ahead, and we hope to have all three of you back again soon at some point to talk about all this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having us here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you.